Also, I guess because it's kind of like an emerging topic, kind of in the wash sector. Um, and maybe I'll just throw out this number first. 8 to 25%. So uh, this is the approximate um, contribution of the sanitation sector to global methane emission. When I say sanitation, I mean sanitation as a whole. So the non-sewer sanitation, but also the sewer sanitation. And so, well, this is quite large. And maybe for those of you working in the climate sector, sanitation isn't something we talk a lot about. Of course, we talk about like transportation or energy, but sanitation is mostly in the sidelines because, like in many of the estimations, it's considered relatively insignificant. Like I think in some IPCC report, it comes up to 2 or 3%, and but that's usually the whole waste sector. So it also includes solid waste. And if we talk about the waste sector, people pay more attention to solid waste, as in like methane in landfill. So the climate aspect in sanitation is often overlooked. There's been efforts in trying to estimate the wastewater sector to global carbon and methane emission, or like a greenhouse gas in general. And so there's this really good paper that came out in 2022. Maybe some of you have read it, maybe you haven't, but this paper by Cheng et al. In 2022 actually focuses more on non-sewer sanitation. But in that paper, they also discussed the findings from sewer sanitation. And so they kind of like compare the two, and this is like, so the estimate of the methane contribution from the wastewater sector, which is, then we can see it's quite large because there's a global methane pledge that was declared a few years ago. And I think in that pledge, they wanted to reduce the methane emission by 30%. So if we can understand more of how the sanitation sector contributes to climate, we can contribute better to the global methane pledge. And I think it's also it's really important to bring sanitation to the climate talk, because it could be a way to get more funding for the climate for the sanitation sector, which is, as we all know, like the wash sector is underfunded, but sanitation is severely underfunded. So by bringing the sanitation sector into the climate talks, this could be a way of generating extra funding through carbon credits and other types of climate funding. And so maybe just a bit of like fundamental background for those of you not really familiar with the topic. So why do we have greenhouse gas from the sanitation sector? Is basically because it's organic matter with our poop, and all organic matter, when it degrades, it could degrade to carbon dioxide if it's aerobic. But we know that most of the wastewater treatment systems, and especially the non-sewer sanitation, are anaerobic. It's basically just the poop sitting there in septic tanks or any type of unmanaged containments. And when it's anaerobic, then it produces methane more than carbon dioxide, and it also produces other gases such as hydrogen sulfide. And even if it's aerobic, in some cases, especially for centralized wastewater treatment plants where you have aerators, even when it's aerobic, it still produces greenhouse gas, which is nitrous oxide, which is a fairly potent greenhouse gas. So either way, it produces greenhouse gas that could be quite significant. And so when we see it from this angle, we can see that it's natural, right? So we have to poop, so we would ultimately produce greenhouse gas. But I guess further question is that how can we manage our wastewater in a more responsible way, climate resilient way, so that it produces the least greenhouse gas possible, while at the same time, of course, serving the public health function of sanitation, which is first and foremost, right? So we talk about climate as a second consideration, with the public health consideration being first. So uh, we've started working on this project just recently. So since last year, it's still ongoing, and we're still working on this um, part on this project until mid 2026. And I'm just yeah, maybe as with this webinar, I guess the thing that I want to highlight is that with breakthrough topics, or like under research topics such as climate and sanitation, especially if we talk about how we want to mitigate greenhouse gas from the sanitation sector, you have to delve in both spectrum, like all ends of the spectrum. So you have to do a lot. Oops, sorry. So you have to do a lot of government engagement, which is the photo on the left. So we're meeting a lot of national government, local government, um, to get them to be part of our study, which is on the right, which our study involves measuring greenhouse gas emissions in wastewater treatments and sanitation systems, like where you have these manholes. Inside them, you have in our pictures, these ones are anaerobic baffled reactors, which we use a lot. So we would expect quite high methanes. And for example, we measure the greenhouse gas emissions using flux chambers that we that we bring into the surface of the sludge, and we leave them for, well, we measure for 24 hours. So in intervals, of course, we don't measure directly for the whole 24 hours, but we have to stand by with our team with different shifts for 24 hours. So it's a lot of macro broad work of bringing in the government and the important stakeholders to get them to understand why climate and sanitation is important, because it's, yeah, no one really thinks about greenhouse gas from the sanitation sector. But then it's also a lot of fundamental work where we deal with methane measurement and nitrous oxide measurements and calibration and all that type of chemistry, biology things. So it's really interesting, and it's still ongoing. It's built on previous research that's been done by other teams from the Leeds University and also the University of Technology Sydney, who's been doing more work on this topic for the last few years. And so this is more on climate in terms of mitigation, right? So how can we mitigate greenhouse gas from the sanitation sector? But of course, if we talk about climate and sanitation, we also need to think about climate adaptation. We've seen, like, from the previous IPCC reports, that adaptation is a sector compared to mitigation that's largely underfunded compared to mitigation. But we know that climate change is happening. It will still happen even though we mitigate to the fullest. So we cannot forget to work on climate adaptation as well. So we tried we did a few studies and research regarding climate adaptation. This is an example of our work that we did with local governments in Indonesia on how to understand sea level rise impact on sanitation and especially sanitation planning. So how could the local government plan their sanitation strategy? Because in Indonesia, we have a document called City Sanitation Strategy that they um, have to publish every 5 to 10 years. And this research was how the local government could integrate their planning, a sea level rise into their planning. And this was quite a challenging research because sea level rise, like climate change in general, is a slow setting issue, right? So you don't quite grasp the challenge, the problem until it's often too late. So we would come to meetings and workshops where people would be like, why do we need to think about sea level rise in sanitation when we don't even have sanitation? So in these workshops we try to yeah, get them to visualize the problem better. So in the left, sorry, on the left side, this is how we're trying to mind map the issue of sea level rise and sanitation so they get a better idea. And on the right, this is them trying to kind of map where floods happen in low-lying areas and if that's affecting the sanitation. So yeah, a lot of activities to try to get the government to um, yeah, better understand the causes and the impacts of sea level rise on sanitation. And this is also a study that we did with UNICEF and UTS. This was a survey, a research that we did, but it involved survey in 4 areas and it involved us investigating how flooding and how, yeah, I think this one is flooding, how flooding affected their access to uh, toilets, and if they didn't have access to toilet, which alternative toilet are they using? And through this, for example, this graph, you can see that if they don't have access to toilet, some or a lot of people, like in Lombok, which is the end is quite small because that is the end that is affected by the flooding. Our sample size is actually bigger, but these are just the people that are affected by the flooding, and you can see that some people would revert back to open defecation. And I think slippage like these, people that have access to toilets but slip back to open defecation, that's important to pay attention to, especially in the issues of climate. So this is an example of how climate change impacts sanitation. But then on the other hand, when we interview the local government, they would say like there's not there's not impact on sanitation that to a level that we need to do anything about it. Like climate change is impacting agriculture, not the sanitation system. So I guess yeah, there's a big work on trying to get people to understand the problem when it's already happening, and you already need to fund and do something about it. So I guess the call to action is how we can do a more transdisciplinary research. So on one hand, you do like fundamental research, which is important, but on the other hand, you need to communicate that to the stakeholders and bring the stakeholders on board through all phases of your project or research or activity. Depending on where you are, the stakeholder involvement can be high, like when it's on the co-design, and then when it's on the dissemination part. And I guess the last call to action is being part of this community of women in water. I think it's really important. So you can work with people with different backgrounds. I'm an academic, so it's good to work with people outside the academic world, but also like how we can also think outside the water box. So I'm part of the National Geographic Explorer. And it's like I meet people like with completely different backgrounds, and they get really excited listening about sanitation because they never hear about it. Um, and so I guess it's good to bring that issue to different world. And on the left is an example where I also work with the Indonesia Scientist Academy, and yeah, with all different scientists like astronomists, lawyers, and stuff, and how we can bring different types of science. For example, this activity was to kids. Yeah, so I guess that's a takeaway from my end.